I am Inspector, and I solve mystery. Welcome to my new case.
It was one of those evenings when the river, seen from Folly Bridge, seemed to wear a veil of ash. The Cherwell, further east, had that same thin sheen, as if the autumn sun, lowering behind the spires, had spent its last ounce of warmth upon the stone. I recall a Don standing at his window in Magdalen, his hand idly lifting the cord of a lamp. The glass caught the fading glow and gave it back in a pale flicker. That image stayed with me, though I did not know why at the time. A lamp lit against the coming dark, its meaning suspended like a clue waiting to be worked. I, meanwhile, was not among the cloisters. I was in my flat as usual, a bottle half empty on the sideboard, and the Times crossword folded on my knee. There was a clue that resisted me. The setter had offered a line from a poem, but it was wrong. I read it again and again, hearing the cadence falter. Someone had tampered with Hopkins, I thought, or perhaps with my memory. A word misplaced, a syllable lost, the music jarred. I felt an odd irritation, not so much with the puzzle as with myself, for doubting whether the poem had been mine to know at all. Lewis had left me earlier that day with a list of things to consider. Small reports, a complaint about some petty theft in Jericho, the usual. But I had not opened the folder. A letter, too, lay unopened on the table, the familiar script of someone who would not expect an answer. I looked at it with the guilt one feels for a task not yet faced, then turned deliberately back to the grid. Whiskey helped, or so I told myself, though it dulled nothing except the will to rise from the chair. The rain began. Light at first, it tapped against the sill, then gathered to a steady rhythm. I listened as I filled in 3 tentative letters, erased them, and replaced them with 2 different ones that looked just as uncertain. The word would not come. A man's mind can stumble over a single letter and still imagine himself clever. I poured another measure. Somewhere in the city, the dawn drew his curtains and the lamp inside burned brighter against the dusk. I pictured him, not because I knew him, but because Oxford has always made me think of its watchers. Men at windows, women at gates, the endless rows of books that stare down from their shelves in unread judgment. The city listens silently to the footsteps of those who believe themselves immortal. And yet, by the morning, the colleges will have lost another one. I suppose that is how memory works. You do not know which image will matter until later, when some absurd connection, some detail overlooked, resurfaces with unwelcome clarity. That night, though, I noticed only the crossword clue. It played upon me with the persistence of a half-forgotten tune. The setter had intended mischief, no doubt. Yet I read the line once more and thought of lamps, of the way light lingers briefly over stone before conceding to the night. My radio crackled on the sideboard, a faint aria breaking through, the static. Puccini, I think. I left it running low, just enough for the music to seep into the silence. Outside, a police siren wailed distantly across Cowley Road. I ignored it. Most things at that hour could be ignored. But the lamp at Magdalen, the misquoted poet, the unopened letter, these settled quietly inside me, like dust on old shelves. Oxford is full of deaths, not the violent sort, not always. Small deaths, quiet ones, the withering of letters unanswered, friendships eroded, romances never spoken. I drank to that, not proudly, not miserably, but with the weary acquiescence of a man who has lived too long among other people's secrets. And when I finally turned off the lamp in my own room, I saw for a second the afterglow of another lamp still burning by the river. A man had already died, though I did not know it then. It was Lewis who first mentioned the note. He read it aloud in his steady Midlands voice while we sat in that grey office of ours, the radiator half-hearted in its duties. She lit the lamp. He had already died. No signature, no context, a fragment of observation as spare as a crossword clue. Such things usually arrive with the morning post, carried in envelopes that smell faintly of tobacco or damp basements. This one had been slipped beneath the door during the night. I remember Lewis looking at me, waiting for an opinion. I had none to give. The words unsettled me not because of their content, but because of their rhythm, the way they divided time into two unyielding halves. Action, then revelation. Light, then death. I told him we should keep it. Pin it to the board if he liked. That was when the call came from Oxford itself. A porter at one of the smaller colleges had discovered a body in the lodge. A guest room, ivy climbing across the windows, the air heavy with the scent of rain-soaked stone. I could picture it before we even set out, though Lewis insisted on driving as usual, his foot heavy on the accelerator while I tried to read through the papers again. The man was retired, an academic of little renown, but known enough within the cloisters to warrant a line or two in the Gazette. His name slips my memory now, or perhaps I choose to let it slip. What remains is the room, the bed neatly made, the body resting atop it as if sleep had been summoned and never dismissed. His spectacles lay beside him, folded with care, and by the bedside, the lamp. Lit, though the doctor assured us death had come before tea was poured in the hall. I walked around the room slowly, listening to its silence. I have always believed that rooms hold on to the echoes of those who depart them. Lewis checked the windows, asked the porter the usual questions. I found myself staring at the lamp. The bulb was new, its glow steady, without the tremor of age. Someone had taken the trouble to light it after he had gone. Why? To disguise the time of death? To provide him with a dignity he could no longer recognize? Or for no reason at all, merely habit, an unconscious gesture. The lodge itself smelled of polish and wet coats. Downstairs, a kettle hissed and one of the scouts murmured that the gentleman had arrived only the day before. No visitors, no disturbances. His meals had been sent up, his tray cleared without remark. A quiet man, she said, and then repeated it as if to absolve herself. Quiet men rarely die noisily. Lewis thought it plain enough. Heart failure, perhaps a stroke. He would wait for the pathologist's report, and in the meantime there was little to detain us. But I could not shake the feeling that the scene had been staged, though staged without artistry. The lamp by the bed, burning needlessly in the day's last light, was like a line misplaced in a poem, not wrong enough to demand attention, but off-key enough to haunt. We left the college with the drizzle soaking through our coats. I paused at the gate and looked back. The lamp in that upper window still glowed faintly against the dusk. Someone had forgotten to switch it off, or someone wanted it left so. I remembered the note again, its curt division of cause and effect. She lit the lamp. He had already died. And I knew, though I said nothing to Lewis, that whoever wrote it had stood where I stood now, looking up at that same light, and had known more than they wished to confess. Lewis asked if I wanted to stop for a pint on the way back. I told him no, though I could have done with one. The words of the note followed me into the car, repeated themselves against the rhythm of the windscreen wipers, and by the time we reached Kidlington I had almost convinced myself that the case was nothing at all. Almost. It is difficult to describe the atmosphere of that particular college without resorting to clichés. Ivy-strangled walls, a quadrangle kept too neat to feel alive, the faintly resentful presence of tourists who snapped photographs of places they would never understand. Yet beyond the gates, past the heavy oak doors and the porter's frowns, it was not tourists who mattered, but the small circle of those who belonged to the college by blood, habit, or sheer stubborn survival. It was there, among them, that our questions began. The bursar greeted us first, a thin woman, efficient in her manner, but there was something brittle about the way her words clipped off, as if each sentence cost her more than she could afford. She carried her ledgers like armor. The deceased, she informed us, had been given the guest room at her own reluctant consent. Space was at a premium, accounts were strained, and she had no wish to extend hospitality beyond necessity. She spoke of him with a tone that tried to be neutral but kept sliding into disdain. Old men living on memories, she said, were a burden on institutions that had no funds for ghosts. I noticed her hands, ink-stained, restless. Resentment rarely hides itself for long. Later, we encountered the visiting American lecturer. He was everything his voice, promised, polished, affable, eager to remind us that his time in Oxford was temporary, an academic holiday he hoped would add luster to his resume. Yet charm is too easily rehearsed. When Lewis asked where he had been during the afternoon of the death, he smiled too quickly, answered too smoothly, a performance meant to leave no residue of doubt. It left me doubting all the more. He reminded me of men who speak fluently in one tongue while quietly betraying themselves in another. There was no malice on his face, only the slight evasiveness of a man guarding something petty yet precarious. The house mistress lived within the college walls, a widow whose eyes moved like shutters against a draught. She allowed us into her parlor, where a coal fire gave off more smoke than heat. She poured tea with hands that did not quite stop shaking. She insisted the deceased had been kind, untroubling, even dull. Her tone, however, was that of someone reciting lines under duress. Fear lingered in her pauses. She seemed to dread not what had happened, but what might yet be revealed. I remember the way she glanced at the portrait above her mantel, her late husband in stiff black gown, as though she asked permission to continue lying. Last was the young researcher. She looked too young to be so worn, her hair falling across her face as if to shield her from notice. She spoke of debt, though not directly, and of academic deadlines that weighed more heavily than money. She confessed to having sought the deceased's guidance, only to find him more distracted by memories than by her papers. There was bitterness there, yes, but also an undercurrent of need, the kind that attaches itself to figures of authority even when those figures have long since ceased to be useful. In that circle, each wore their mask. Efficiency, charm, fear, desperation, none wholly convincing, all curiously rehearsed. The retired academic, unremarkable though he might have been, had left behind not just a body in a guest room, but a set of fractures in the lives around him. I recall standing once more beneath the climbing ivy, Lewis beside me, the evening light draining into the stones. He thought we had learned little. Perhaps he was right, yet I could not shake the sense that every one of them had, in some small way, already prepared their defense, as if they had known this day was coming, and each had chosen their part to play before the curtain rose. And above us, in the fading dusk, the lamp still glowed at the lodge window, indifferent to the truths it illuminated. It was not in the lodge or the quadrangle that I first noticed her, but by the iron gate, half ajar, where the ivy hung in heavy, rain-dark clusters. She had paused beneath the old lamp that marked the entrance, her scarf slipping loose in the wind. A simple gesture, the way she lifted her hands to knot it more securely, the fingers lingering longer than required. I cannot say why such small things catch my attention. Lewis would tell you it is distraction, that I ought to keep my eyes on the ledgers and the pathologist's charts. Yet for me, it is in such minor, overlooked gestures that a case begins to tremble into focus. I stepped nearer, more out of instinct than purpose. She turned, surprised but unflustered. A pale face, not young but marked with that unassuming beauty which is the companion of thought rather than vanity. Her eyes held mine for a fraction longer than politeness required. We exchanged the usual banalities. The weather, the encroaching term, the endless tourists who trampled Oxford as if it were a garden to be consumed. Then, quite suddenly, she offered a line of verse, half in jest. She said the rain in Oxford fell with the grace of Hopkins, then recited a fragment that jarred my ear. I knew the poem well enough to hear the error. A single word misplaced, robbed of Hopkins's sprung rhythm, leaving the line awkward, lame. I made no correction. I rarely do. But in that instant, something shifted in my mind. The note that had found its way under our door, the lamp left burning in the room, the widow's tremor, all these had hovered without meaning. Now, with her casual misquotation, I felt the faintest echo, a thread unspooling somewhere in the dark. Lewis appeared at my side, impatient. He carried a small notebook cluttered with his blunt handwriting. He muttered that the pathologist had fixed the death at some time after 2, no later than 5. Tea untouched on the tray, pulse stilled, nothing more exotic than a heart's betrayal. He urged me to look at the timetable. Who saw him last? Who heard him coughing in the stairwell? Who brought his supper tray? All the mundane certainties that form the skeleton of an inquiry. I nodded, though my eyes returned to the woman. She listened to Lewis with that subtle detachment one finds in people accustomed to observing from the margin. When I asked if she had known the deceased, she hesitated. "Only in passing," she said. He was a presence more than a person. A name once mentioned in her mother's stories, a man glimpsed in the college library, nothing more. Yet she lingered, as if waiting for permission to go. There was, I confess, a faint stirring in me, the melancholy attraction that arrives too late and for the wrong reasons. She was intelligent, her voice carried traces of learning, and yet she was wrapped in some inaccessibility, as if the scarf about her throat guarded more than her skin. I've always been too quick to sense the distance in others and too slow to accept it. When she finally departed, her step light against the gravel, Lewis gave me that look of his, half amusement, half dismay. "You'll find no answers in scarves and poetry," he muttered. "Best keep to the timetable." I let him believe he was right. But in my head, the misquoted Hopkins lingered, out of key, demanding notice. It joined the anonymous note, the lamp that burned for a man already gone, and the uneasy silence of those who called themselves his friends. And as the gates clanged shut behind her, I thought again of how often truth announces itself not in the grand gesture, but in the stray word spoken wrong, in the scarf adjusted too carefully, in the lamplight that burns when there is no one left to see it. The report arrived in the flat brown envelope they always use, as if anonymity could soften the blow of its contents. I slit it open with the blunt edge of a knife, poured myself a whiskey, and read the words twice before they began to settle. The medical examiner had found traces of barbiturates, not enough, perhaps, to fell a healthy man, but for one whose heart was already faltering, the dose might well have tilted him from the edge into the abyss. Cause of death, then, recorded not simply as cardiac failure, but failure complicated by ingestion of sedative substances. A polite way of saying that someone, knowingly or not, had helped him along. Lewis read the same lines beside me and whistled softly. "Sleeping tablets," he said. "They'll have been in the room. They always are." And indeed, when the scouts had cleared the bedside table, a small amber bottle had been found, its label half rubbed away but legible enough. Prescribed months earlier. The cap twisted on loosely, as though returned in haste. The house mistress's name surfaced almost immediately. She had charge of the keys, supervised the trays, arranged the linen. She had, as the porter put it, the run of the place. Her face, I remembered, had twitched with nervous habit, her hands unable to steady even the teapot. Lewis was convinced already. A lonely widow, proximity to the deceased, a mind perhaps clouded by affection or resentment. What more did we need? Yet there was more. From among the papers gathered from the room, a diary emerged. Thin leather cover, the pages filled with the cramped hand of the dead man. Most entries banal, reminders of appointments, quotations of poetry, half remembered. But on the day before his death, one line caught the light. Her hand upon the lamp. 4 words, nothing more. The lamp again, that silent witness. Who else but the house mistress could he have meant? It was neat. Too neat. Lewis, notebook open, mapped it out with satisfaction. Pills within her reach. A diary illusion. Opportunity beyond question. Even motive could be shaped, if we chose to imagine she sought either to relieve him from suffering or to rid herself of a tenant who knew too much. It was the kind of case that would please a magistrate. Squared corners, tidy conclusion. But my unease grew heavier with each symmetry. I have never trusted cases that resolve themselves with such elegance. Truth, in my experience, is rarely so obliging. The dead leave behind not harmony but discord, and this had all the polish of invention. I thought again of her frightened eyes in that smoke-clogged parlor, her gaze flicking toward her husband's portrait as though afraid to be overheard even by paint and canvas. Was that the face of a poisoner? Or merely the face of a woman long accustomed to bearing other people's secrets without the means to deny them? I walked the college corridors again that evening. The lamp in the lodge burned still, unchanged, its filament buzzing faintly against the dusk. I imagined the dead man writing those words, her hand upon the lamp, not as accusation but as memory, a fragment of something said, something observed. Perhaps he had been quoting, misquoting, as he often did. Perhaps the line belonged not to him, but to Hopkins, or to some forgotten verse hidden in the back of his mind. And perhaps it had nothing to do with the house mistress at all. Lewis urged me not to overcomplicate. A bottle, a diary, a nervous woman with access. It was all there. But I have learned, painfully often, that when evidence presents itself like a stage set, one ought to look for the unseen hand arranging the curtains. Someone wanted us to see her in that light. Someone wanted us to close the book quickly. And if there is one thing Oxford has taught me, it is that nothing closes quickly here. Not books, not wounds, not truth. So I left the lamp burning in my mind, its glow too deliberate, its shadows too deep. The first solution had offered itself, and Lewis was half ready to accept it, but I knew we had only stumbled upon the first illusion, the first red herring cast across the water to distract us from the shape moving silently beneath. The crossword was spread before me like an old adversary. My pencil hovered, my glass of whiskey half emptied, the lamplight catching the corner of the page. Across the middle ran a clue that refused to be ignored. Light before death, death before light. At first it felt like the usual wordplay, some pun on lamps or dawns or the last syllables of a Greek tragedy. But the phrasing echoed too precisely the words that had been slipped beneath our office door. She lit the lamp. He had already died. Coincidence is a word I have never trusted. I underlined it, stared at it, and for a moment felt the pulse of something taking shape. Lewis called just as I was filling in a tentative answer that pleased me for its symmetry, but made no sense at all. He was in the car park, ready to drive. He had gathered that the bursar was free and that the American had asked to see us again. I closed the puzzle with reluctance, slipped it into my coat, and followed him into the drizzle. The bursar received us with her usual stiffness, her office heavy with the smell of paper and damp wood. Ledgers towered around her like headstones. I asked if she had corresponded with the deceased, and she hesitated a fraction too long before admitting she had once seen a letter not meant for her. She spoke quickly then, to drown the pause. The envelope mislaid, the porter confused, the handwriting familiar enough to tempt her curiosity. She would not reveal its contents, only muttered that it contained private matters and that she had burned it to preserve the college's dignity. Her lips tightened as she spoke, as if bracing against the possibility of disbelief. It was not the words, but the way she emphasized them that caught me. A person who truly wished to forget would not repeat private matters with such insistence. I noted it, though Lewis grew restless, tapping his pen against his notebook. He was thinking of pills, of opportunities, of the simple route to resolution. We found the American lecturer in the common room, reclining as though Oxford were his personal theatre. He greeted us warmly, too warmly, and launched into a rehearsal of his movements on the afternoon of the death. He insisted he had been in the Bodleian until 5, researching a paper on Renaissance sermons. His voice was a performance, confident, expansive. But then he slipped. He referred to the porter locking the library doors just after 6, though he had claimed to have left by 5. I asked him to repeat himself, and he adjusted the time, casually, too casually. A man accustomed to persuading audiences, but not accustomed to being cross-examined. Lewis muttered later, as we walked the corridor, that Americans always talk too much. Perhaps. Yet what troubled me was not his volume, but his smoothness. He wanted his alibi to be accepted without friction, yet his own phrasing betrayed him. Words, like numbers, rarely align when rehearsed too quickly. By evening, my irritation had thickened. I returned to my flat with the crossword once more spread before me. Light before death, death before light. It teased me like a riddle whispered at the edge of a dream. I thought of the lamp in the room, burning though the man had already gone. I thought of the bursar and her unseen letter, of the American with his clumsy timeline, of the widow and her trembling tea. Each offered a motive, each carried a thread, yet none tied into a knot I could trust. Lewis, loyal as ever, tried to ease my restlessness. He reminded me of the examiner's report, of the tablets, of the diary line. He believed we already had enough. I told him, though quietly, that enough is rarely enough. It is in the contradictions that truth emerges, not in the neatness. And so I let the clue sit unsolved at the center of the crossword, an empty space staring back at me. Light before death, death before light. It was less an answer than a rhythm, a pattern. And patterns, I have learned, are where murder begins to reveal itself. Not in the evidence we are handed, but in the slips, the echoes, the misquotes, the words spoken wrong by those who think themselves cleverer than silence. The inn was nearly empty, the kind of place that never sought custom but survived on habit. A fire whispered in the grate, half choked with damp wood, and the wine, a claret poured without flourish, bled darkly into my glass. I sat alone at a corner table, the stone walls seeping, chill even through the plaster, and let the taste unspool into memory. I've often found that wine brings with it a kind of melancholy clarity, not the sharpness of deduction, but the languid awareness of time squandered, each sip a tally of what has slipped beyond recall. That evening I thought of the woman at the gate, the way she had tightened her scarf with unnecessary care, the Hopkins she had misquoted, the distance in her gaze that matched so precisely the distances within myself. I wondered, not for the first time, whether such women ever saw me as anything beyond the outline of a tired detective, a man whose affections were more reliable in silence than in pursuit. Outside, rain glazed the cobbles, and the sound of it against the window mocked the minutes. I traced the rim of my glass with a finger, imagining a different life in which I had chosen teaching, or perhaps nothing at all. Oxford is merciless with men who linger too long at its edges. The scholars who remain grow fossilized, the visitors depart with trophies, and the rest of us, men like me, are left to haunt the pubs with regrets we disguise as conversation. I thought again of the anonymous note. She lit the lamp. He had already died. It returned now with the rhythm of a refrain. A woman lighting a lamp, not to reveal life, but to conceal death. Was it care or deceit? The puzzle hung there, suspended in the smoke-filled air of the inn, mocking the claret's warmth. The fire cracked. A couple left their table near the door, their laughter brief and echoing. I considered ordering another bottle, though even Lewis would have called that indulgence. I remembered her face. intelligent, unyielding, as if she had long ago resigned herself to withholding the better part of her affections. Women like that have followed me all my life, or perhaps I have only chosen to notice those I cannot reach. It was near midnight when the landlord shuffled past, asking if I required anything further. I shook my head. The wine had already begun its slow fog. I was on the verge of leaving when the innkeeper handed me the telephone from behind the bar. Stranger's voice arrived distorted, as though speaking from another century. He sounded half apologetic, half amused. The solicitor had rung him, he said. Something curious had come to light. The deceased's will, altered within the past year. Significant alterations, apparently. Beneficiaries rearranged, legacies reassigned. Not unusual in itself, but in this case the timing was inconvenient. And, Strange added, the will had yet to be filed in its proper form. He chuckled in that unmusical way of his, as though death and inheritance were part of the same comic pageant. I thanked him, though not warmly, and replaced the receiver. Wine and regret make poor companions for news of legal intrigue. Yet even through the haze, the word alteration lodged in my thoughts like grit in a shoe. A will revised is a promise disturbed. Someone, somewhere, within that college circle, had stood to gain by a death that might otherwise have seemed natural. I left the inn and walked through the wet streets. The lamps along the high burned in their usual indifference, each halo a reminder of the lives they outlast. I thought of her again, the scarf, the lamp at the gate, the Hopkins spoken wrong. And I wondered, with a kind of weary certainty, whether anything in Oxford ever truly died, or whether it all simply shifted hands. Wine, wills, women, regrets, until the city itself grew tired of keeping count. The photograph came to me folded into a file, brittle with age, the corners softened from years of careless storage. Lewis had found it among the deceased's papers, slipped between the pages of an old lecture transcript. I unfolded it slowly, the way one does with relics, and let the dust of decades rise faintly from the image. A group of students stood arrayed on the steps of the college library. Black gowns, pale faces, the stiff formality of a year now long gone. In the center, recognizable even through the blur, was the man we had found in the lodge bed. Younger, unspectacled, his mouth caught between confidence and uncertainty. He leaned slightly forward, as if already trying to hear the voices that might outlast him. But it was not he who held my gaze. It was the corner, nearly cropped, almost accidental. There, half-shadowed by another's gown, stood a woman. Her features were blurred, her face turned just enough to avoid the camera's certainty, yet familiar in outline. I thought first of the young researcher who had spoken to us, with hair falling across her eyes, her voice carrying that tremor of exhaustion. And then, with the slow cruelty of recognition, I saw it. Not her, but her mother. The likeness was inescapable. The angle of the jaw, the tilt of the head, the guardedness. The researcher's mother had once been a student here, standing only a step away from the man whose body we now examined for traces of barbiturate, generations entwined by accident or something darker. Lewis, peering over my shoulder, whistled. "Looks like history repeats," he said. I said nothing. But within me a question began to gnaw. Was this merely a photograph, or was it the echo of an old betrayal carried forward into the present? Later that afternoon I searched again through the diary we had collected from the lodge. Its thin pages, so eager to fall apart, yielded a strange absence. Between one day and the next, a sheet had been neatly removed. The thread still showed where it had once been stitched, but the page itself was gone. A gap, nothing more, yet in that silence I felt the weight of confession. Men do not tear pages from their diaries unless those pages contain truths too brittle to endure another's eyes. The missing leaf, the photograph, the young researcher's quiet bitterness. These arranged themselves in my mind like pieces of a puzzle that refused to click. I thought of an affair, perhaps, long buried in the academic quietude of the college. A man of letters, a student drawn to his orbit, secrets exchanged beneath the lamplight of forgotten rooms. And now, decades later, a daughter burdened with debts, a death too conveniently ambiguous, a lamp lit in a room where breath had already ceased. I imagined the young researcher discovering her mother's connection, feeling the shadow of that intimacy fall upon her own precarious life. Did she see the old man as guardian, betrayer, or both? Did she seek redress for a mother who had been abandoned, or silence for a scandal that threatened her own fragile career? Revenge and protection wear the same mask when viewed from a distance. Lewis remained more pragmatic. He suggested the page had been torn out simply because it contained some trivial remark, some personal embarrassment. A man's vanity, nothing more. But I could not accept such economy. Diaries, like photographs, are rarely casual. They are kept with the intention of being read, even if only by the self who writes them. To remove a page is to erase not memory, but guilt. That night, alone again with the crossword untouched, I set the photograph beside me. The blurred face in the corner would not leave my thoughts. It was as though she were leaning not toward the camera, but toward me, whispering across years that what I sought was not in the bottle of pills nor the frightened hands of the house mistress. What I sought was buried in that missing page, in the silence between mother and daughter, in the unlit corners of Oxford's memory. I poured another glass, knowing the wine would not answer me. The photograph lay on the table, its edges curling, and in the glow of my own lamp I wondered if the past ever dies at all, or if it simply waits, like a ghost at the corner of a picture, for the right moment to step forward. For several days I allowed myself the indulgence of certainty. It is a dangerous habit in detective work, but irresistible when the pieces seem to fall into place with such obliging neatness. The American lecturer, smooth, evasive, ever ready with a practiced smile, had debts he could not meet and a vanity that brooked no humiliation. The deceased, I reasoned, had stood in his way, a reminder of mediocrity, an obstacle to advancement, perhaps even a threat to expose a small dishonesty. The motive was not grand, but then murder rarely is. Pride and desperation suffice. I constructed the sequence carefully, with all the satisfaction of filling a crossword grid. The pills obtained easily enough, the opportunity provided by his regular visits to the lodge, the lamp lit to disguise the hour of death. His alibi at the Bodleian, rehearsed too fluently, betrayed itself with a slip of an unnecessary detail. I knew it then as surely as I have ever known anything. The American had hastened the old man's end, confident that Oxford would bury the truth as readily as it buries its footnotes. Lewis listened, with the patience of one long accustomed to my theories. He asked his questions, ticked his boxes. He admitted that it all sounded plausible, even probable. And for a time he shared my conviction. I saw in his eyes the relief of a case nearing its conclusion, the desire for resolution after too many days of circling shadows. But conviction is a fragile thing. That night, back in my flat, I poured myself another whiskey and laid out the anonymous note once more upon the table. Its paper had grown soft from handling, the words etched into my mind. She lit the lamp. He had already died. I had read it a dozen times, perhaps more, but now, in the small hours when silence presses hardest, I noticed what I had not before. The tense. Not she lit the lamp and he was dead. Not he must have died. But he had already died. A sequence too precise, too assured. Whoever wrote those words did not guess, did not surmise. They knew. They knew the lamp had been lit after death, not before. They had seen, or they had been told by one who had seen. It was not speculation, it was witness. The American could not have written it. His entire performance relied upon denying his presence in the lodge at the critical hour. To admit such knowledge would have been to expose himself utterly. No, the note came from elsewhere, from someone whose eyes had lingered on the room long enough to mark that small, theatrical detail. I sat back in my chair, the whiskey gone flat on my tongue. My perfect symmetry crumbled. The airtight logic leaked. What I had built was not a solution, but a false construction, tidy only because I had forced the pieces into their places. The American remained guilty of something: arrogance, deception, perhaps petty fraud. But not of this. Lewis would not be pleased. He had allowed himself to believe in the neatness of it. Yet even he has learned that my irritations at night often lead to dismantling what we have so carefully arranged by day. I thought again of the woman at the gate, her scarf, her misquotation of Hopkins. I thought of the missing diary page, of the photograph's blurred corner, of the bursar's burned letter. Each fragment seemed suddenly louder in the silence. The note lay before me, its simple phrasing now heavier than any confession. She lit the lamp. He had already died. The rhythm of it, the certainty. Whoever had written it had bound themselves irrevocably to the scene, and though I did not yet know their name, I knew that the truth, like the crossword clue I still had not solved, lay not in the elegance of my false solution, but in the overlooked detail, the tense of a verb, the sequence of light and death. I turned out my own lamp at last and lay in the dark, uneasy, aware that I had circled too quickly toward an answer that could not hold. The real solution waited, still hidden, but closer now, as close as the echo of footsteps fading down an Oxford corridor. I found her again by the same gate, as if the city itself had drawn her back to that small iron threshold where ivy concealed more than it revealed. Evening had thickened, the lamp above her head buzzing faintly as though it carried the residue of secrets. She saw me approach and did not flinch. Her scarf was wound carefully this time, no loose ends to betray her fingers. I spoke without preamble. The words had arranged themselves too neatly in my mind to be delayed. She had been in the room. She had lit the lamp, and she had known, before anyone else, that the man upon the bed was already gone. Her face altered only slightly, a narrowing of the eyes, a breath caught between denial and resignation. She did not ask how I knew. She must have understood that the smallest of her gestures had already given her away, the misquoted Hopkins, the scarf tightened with unnecessary deliberation, the hesitation that lingered between each of her sentences. We walked a little way along the path, her pace measured, mine slowed by years and by habit. She confessed with a calmness that unsettled me. She had entered the lodge not to kill, but to preserve. She found him lifeless, the lamp unlit, the stillness absolute. She had lit the lamp not for him, but for herself, and for what he represented. On the table, she said, there had been a letter. Its contents made plain an affair her mother had once endured with him, an affair now reduced to a page, but capable of breathing scandal into the present. She had taken the letter, removed it before the scouts could find it, and left the lamp burning as if to restore dignity to the scene. I listened. Lewis would have asked for proof, for times, for details. But I had learned that her very phrasing carried its own proof. She spoke as one who has carried a burden in silence and felt relief in its telling. Her motive was not ambition nor greed, but that old Oxford instinct for concealment. Protect the college, protect the name, protect the mother who had given her too much of her own sorrow. I asked why she had written the note, for I was certain now it was hers. She smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. To keep the truth from rotting within, she said. Words on paper can carry guilt away. She had wanted someone to know, even if no one would understand. We stood then by the lamp as it sputtered, and I thought of how easily light deceives. It reveals and it conceals in the same moment. She had hoped the lamp would disguise the hour of his death. had hoped it would soften the cruelty of discovery, yet all it had done was illuminate the absence he had left behind. There was no charge to bring. He had died of natural causes. The pills were incidental, the will irrelevant. What remained was a woman who had sought to shield her mother's memory from a past too awkward to surface. A concealment, not a crime. And yet in her act, she had drawn herself into the story more tightly than if she had left the room untouched. When we parted, she adjusted her scarf once more. The gesture seemed final, as though sealing herself back into the life she had chosen. I watched her walk into the mist that clung to the street beyond the gate. Oxford swallowed her as it has swallowed countless others, leaving me with the quiet certainty that the case had ended not with revelation, but with resignation. And I, left alone, wondered again whether I had ever solved anything at all, or merely arranged fragments until they resembled truth. The lamp above the gate flickered once, twice, then steadied, its glow indifferent to the living and the dead alike. It was not in some formal office or interview room that her words came, but in the half-light of a college parlor, its curtains drawn against the drizzle, the faint smell of polish and extinguished coal fire in the air. She sat across from me, her scarf folded neatly on her lap, her eyes lowered as if speaking to the rug rather than to me. I had long ceased pressing her with questions. Silence, in the end, does more to summon confession than any interrogation. She said she had not killed him. The words were quiet, almost unneeded, for I already knew. What she had done was smaller, yet not without consequence. She had entered the lodge, found him still upon the bed, his face slackened by death's ordinary touch. On the table, a letter addressed but unsealed, its words reaching backward into her mother's youth. The affair, hidden for decades, sketched there with enough clarity to stain reputations long after those involved had ceased to defend them. She spoke of her mother with a kind of reverence threaded through regret. A woman whose life had not been easy, who had already surrendered enough to silence. To let that letter fall into official hands, to become part of the record, would have been to resurrect a shame that should have been left buried. So she took it, folded it quickly, pressed it into her coat, and then, in a moment of impulse, lit the lamp beside the bed. To make the room less stark, she said, to make his death appear, if not noble, at least softened. She had not thought what story the act might tell. Her confession carried none of the theatrics one expects. She did not weep, did not beg. She merely stated what she had done, the way a student reports a figure miscopied in an equation. It was the shame, not the act itself, that trembled in her voice. She feared less the law than the exposure of her mother's past. Lewis, sitting with us, shifted uneasily. He asked whether we should pursue it, whether concealment was not itself a crime. She looked at him with a calmness that silenced him. The college, she said, would wish it forgotten. The bursar already knew more than she admitted. The house mistress suspected, but would never speak. The American lecturer was too consumed by his own deceptions to care, all of them bound in one way or another by complicity. Oxford's greatest skill, after all, is silence. I found myself both relieved and saddened. Relieved that the death had not been hastened by malice, that the symmetry of poisoning and plots was nothing more than illusion. Saddened because her reasoning, fragile as it was, belonged to that same Oxfordian melancholy I knew too well. The instinct to preserve dignity through concealment, even when truth itself is strangled. Lewis muttered afterwards that it would be cleaner to file the report as natural causes and let the matter rest. He was right. Nothing more could be proved. Nothing more was truly wanted. The lamp would be remembered only as a detail in the margins. The letter gone into whatever fire she had chosen. When I left the parlor, the corridors of the college seemed emptier than before. A hush clung to the stone as if the walls themselves had agreed to her confession and promised to keep it. I walked out through the gate where I had first seen her, the lamp above the arch faint in the drizzle. She remained inside, folded into the silence she had chosen. Oxford has always thrived on such silences. Scandals half known, affairs half buried, confessions whispered only once. I carried hers with me not as evidence, but as a reminder that sometimes a case does not close with justice, but with quiet complicity, and for reasons I could scarcely admit, I let it remain so. It ended, as so many things in Oxford do, without ceremony. No trial, no headlines, no clatter of gavels or satisfied proclamations. The file, slim and unsatisfactory, was marked natural causes. The death of a retired academic, unremarkable in life and now reduced to a line in a report. If there was deception, it lay not in murder, but in the quieter manipulations of human weakness. A letter removed, a lamp lit too late, the rearrangement of a scene that should have been left untouched. Lewis accepted it readily enough. He said there was nothing more to be done. And he was right. The pills, the diary, the false alibis, all had dissolved into irrelevance once her confession had settled between us. What remained was not crime, but shame, and shame has never been the jurisdiction of the police. He closed his notebook with a snap and went off to meet his wife, leaving me with the silence that follows when a case ends without ending. I returned to my flat with the familiar company of my crossword. The clue that had haunted me still stood blank in the center. Light before death, death before light. I had tried a dozen variations, none of them convincing. It resisted me with the same quiet insistence as the case itself. Perhaps it was not meant to be solved. Perhaps some words, like some lives, remained deliberately incomplete. I sharpened my pencil, filled 2 letters, erased them, and poured myself another whiskey. Outside, dusk thickened into evening. The city's lamps began to glow one by one, their halos softened by mist. I leaned at the window, glass in hand, and watched as a light flickered in a distant room across the high. A small, unremarkable square of brightness. Someone's lamp lit, against the falling dark. I thought of the lodge lamp, of the woman at the gate with her scarf, of the letter that would never be read. The patterns returned, weaving themselves into a tapestry without conclusion. I whispered a line of poetry then, half remembered, half misquoted, as though the words themselves had grown tired of accuracy. It did not matter. The sentiment was enough. Oxford thrives on such fragments, unfinished verses, unspoken loves, secrets that outlast the bodies which once carried them. The whiskey warmed my throat, though not my heart. I turned from the window, left the crossword unsolved, and switched off my own lamp. In the darkness that followed, the silence of the city pressed in, not oppressive, not merciful, merely present. A silence that had heard too many stories like this one and would hear countless more. So the case concluded, not with revelation, but with ambiguity, not with triumph, but with the quiet acknowledgement that some truths are too fragile to expose. A man had died, naturally enough. A woman had protected her mother's memory, clumsily enough. And I, as ever, was left to bear the weight of what was not spoken. In the dark, I thought again of the note. She lit the lamp. He had already died. The words no longer troubled me. They seemed less accusation than epitaph. Light fades, death remains, and the rest is silence.